I've always been careful with money. Not stingy, just aware. Maybe it's because I watched my parents lose our house when I was 12 after my dad's startup crashed, or because my brother spent his 20s digging out of student debt. Either way, when Ethan proposed and my parents gifted us $120 for the wedding, I saw it as a start, not a finish. We agreed to spend $80K on the wedding and save $40K for our future kids. At least, that's what I thought we agreed on. The first red flag wasn't even a flag, just a flicker. 6 months into planning, Ethan casually mentioned adding 50 guests, coworkers, college buddies, people I'd never met. I laughed it off, thinking he was joking. Our guest list was already at 200. But the next day, our wedding planner, Claire, called because Ethan had emailed her a new list. When I asked why, he merely shrugged and said they were important enough to cost us an extra $15K in catering and rentals. I had chosen the venue specifically to save money. A historic library with soaring ceilings and stained glass, half the price of the luxury hotels that Ethan had wanted. He dismissed it as cheap, not calling it quaint or vintage. Later, Claire mentioned that he'd been emailing her behind my back, demanding upgrades I'd already vetoed. Ice sculptures, a live band, gold-plated silverware. When I confronted him about it, he claimed that Claire had insulted my taste, insisting that she thought my taste was tacky. Meanwhile, Claire and I had bonded over ideas for thrifted decor. That week at brunch, his sister Mara let me know that their dad's business partners were coming and that their mom had been particularly fussy about the seating chart. Their dad's construction company was struggling, and apparently a showstopper wedding might salvage some contracts. When I mentioned it to Ethan, he snapped and insisted they were just looking out for us, even though it felt like they were looking out for themselves. 2 days later, while I was organizing bills, I found a loan application in his desk drawer showing $25 in credit card debt, all from networking trips over the past year. When I confronted him, he tried to pass it off as old news from before we met, even though the dates were recent. He accused me of snooping and not trusting him. I almost believed him. Almost. Then charges started popping up on our joint account. There was a $3 deposit for a DJ I'd never heard of. When I called the company, they told me that Ethan had canceled the booking a week prior and that there would be no refund. He insisted that the DJ was non-negotiable and complained that my frugality was embarrassing him. Later, my brother, a financial advisor, pulled me aside after dinner and warned that Ethan was bleeding me dry, saying that this wasn't a wedding, but a spectacle. The next morning, Ethan's mom called and advised me to let him lead, adding that men need pride. I almost gagged. Pride doesn't put braces on future kids, and pride doesn't pay mortgages. The day after, I drove to the library venue alone, needing clarity. The coordinator greeted me with a frown and explained that my fiancé had tried to cancel last week, claiming that I had changed my mind. My chest tightened as I assured her that wasn't true. That night, I ended up checking Ethan's email on our shared laptop. Scrolling past Venmo requests and LinkedIn alerts, I found a message to a jeweler asking how quickly they could appraise a 2-carat solitaire. The following morning, I transferred the $40 savings to a separate account. When Ethan noticed, he banged his fist on the kitchen counter and accused me of trying to control everything. I didn't mention the emails or the DJ, I just said I was exploring investments. His face went cold as he insisted that we were supposed to be a team. A few days later, I discovered a receipt in his gym bag for a $5 wristwatch with a memo reading, "Gift for Jay." I wish I could say I marched downstairs and demanded answers, but I didn't. I sat on the bathroom floor, staring at the tiles we'd picked out together last spring. Ethan's toothbrush was still wet from that morning, and his cologne lingered on my hoodie. For a second, I wondered if Jay was a client, a cousin, or even just a mistake. But deep down, I knew. I'm not sure what to do next. Part of me wants to burn it all down, cancel the venue, send his mom a screenshot of that receipt, scream until my throat cracks. The other part remembers how he cried when he proposed, how he held me after my dad's heart attack, how he promised that our kids would never have to worry about money the way I did. But promises don't pay debts, and $40 won't fix a future built on lies. So, Reddit, do I fight for the man I love, or try to salvage the life that's already been sold out from under me? Now for the first update. 2 weeks ago, and I posted about my fiancé Ethan draining our wedding fund behind my back. I thought things couldn't get any worse, but I was wrong. A few days after discovering a receipt for a $5 watch labeled as a gift for Jay, I hesitated for 3 days, hoping there might be some reasonable explanation. A client, a mentor, anyone except her. When I finally brought it up, Ethan didn't even pause. He casually said it was for his dad and for the wedding. That left me baffled because his dad, James, had always insisted that vintage ties were his thing and had dismissed Rolexes as too gaudy. Still, I nodded and let him kiss my forehead, even though my skin crawled. The very next day at a coworker's barbecue, I was stirring potato salad when the host's wife sidled over and remarked how excited I must be for Cancun, mentioning that Ethan had been stressing over resort bookings for weeks. I froze. Our honeymoon was meant to be a quiet week at a lakeside cabin 2 hours away, a plan I had chosen to save money. Later, when I asked Ethan about it, he laughed too loudly, brushing off my concerns by saying she must have confused him with someone else in an inside joke with the guys. His hand on my lower back felt like a branding iron. That night, I waited until the sound of the shower masked the noise before taking his phone. My fingers trembled as I mistyped his passcode twice until I finally gained access. Searching for Jay, I discovered a conversation with Jenna, his college ex, whom he had once dismissed as clingy and toxic when I asked about their breakup. The messages, though few, were damning. I recalled that about 8 days earlier, Jenna had asked if their plans for Cancun were still on. Ethan had agreed, instructing her to keep everything quiet until after a certain point. Jenna responded with a mix of excitement and incredulity that he might leave me after the wedding, and he had curtly told her not to push the issue. I took screenshots, emailed them to myself, and then sat on the edge of the tub, watching steam curl under the bathroom door. When he emerged with a towel around his waist, I calmly asked if he wanted tea, my voice steady enough that it didn't even crack. The following morning, I called my brother. Instead of the usual "I told you so," he simply asked what I needed. By noon, he had helped me freeze our joint account. Within hours, Ethan noticed something was wrong. He stormed into our apartment, his face flushed with anger, demanding to know why his card had declined at lunch. When I inquired about Jenna, he halted mid-rant, clearly taken aback as he asked who she was. I printed the texts and laid them out on our kitchen table as undeniable evidence before driving over to my brother's place. Meanwhile, Ethan had left 23 voicemails. The first several messages were filled with apologies, pleading for a chance to talk and explain, but soon they turned into angry threats that I was ruining everything, followed by silence. Later that day, sitting on my brother's couch that smelled of stale popcorn and regret, I met with a no-nonsense lawyer. She advised me to document every receipt, every text, every lie. In her blunt way, she explained that this wasn't just a case of cold feet. He was carefully covering his tracks. 3 days later, I returned to our apartment to gather a few things. Ethan wasn't there, but his laptop was left glowing on the coffee table with a half-finished email to Jenna still open. My stomach sank as I noticed a folder labeled "Wedding," filled with invoices for services like florists and caterers, and even a $12,000 bridal gown from a boutique I had never heard of. The receipt was dated just 2 days after we had picked out my own dress together. I called my parents immediately. Dad answered on the first ring and told me to come over without a moment's delay. Sitting at their kitchen table, I could see Mom clutching her coffee cup like a lifeline while I explained everything. Dad kept murmuring that they would fix this, as if I were a broken appliance. They arranged for a family meeting with Ethan, who quickly replied by insisting that I was blowing things out of proportion and telling me to come home. I refused to go back and instead called a locksmith to change the locks. While the locksmith worked, I received a voicemail from Ethan's mom warning me that I would regret humiliating him and that they would make sure of it. Her tone was unnervingly calm, almost sweet, the same tone she had used when complimenting my engagement photos. Now, I'm sitting in my car outside our apartment with the engine off, staring at the new deadbolt. Part of me wants to burn everything to the ground, while another part longs for the Ethan who had once cried during the movie Up and made heart-shaped pancakes. But the evidence, the receipts, the texts, the extravagant gown, aren't just red flags. They're confirmation of a complete betrayal. I can't stop thinking about the library venue either. I remember how confused the coordinator looked when I showed up unexpectedly, saying that Ethan had mentioned canceling. At the time, I thought it was all about the money. Now I realize it was really about erasing me. The $40,000 is safe, and so am I. But I keep wondering when I became the obstacle in my own life and why it took a second wedding dress for me to finally see it all clearly. Now for the second update. It's been 6 months since I last posted about calling off my wedding to Ethan, and many of you have asked for an update on how things are going. After I changed the locks and moved into my brother's place, the legal mess began. Most of the wedding deposits were refunded, but Ethan still owed me $15 for the Cancun trip he'd secretly booked. His lawyer sent me letters filled with bureaucratic phrases meant to suggest honest negotiations, while mine argued that it was simply a delaying tactic. Every time I thought about the money, a tightness would form in my chest. Not because of the amount, but because it felt like he was still trying to control the narrative. Later on, I ran into Ethan's cousin, Mara, at a downtown coffee shop. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, but she sat down and explained that Jenna had ended things with him about a month after everything blew up. Apparently, when Ethan's double life unraveled, Jenna discovered that he'd been deceiving her too, about leaving me quickly, about the money, even about a second wedding dress. Mara dismissed it with a wry remark about karma that made me snort into my latte. It wasn't until I got to my car that I allowed myself to cry. Not for him, but for the realization that only after 2 women compared receipts was his deception exposed. Soon enough, his family's carefully maintained image began to crumble. His father's business partners started withdrawing their investments, pointing to concerns about his reliability. I learned about this through a Google alert I'd set up after his mom began making threats. Part of me wondered if his obsession with a lavish wedding had been his way of trying to measure up to his father's expectations. But then I remembered the $5 watch meant for Jenna, and any lingering sympathy evaporated. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into projects, and the promotion I landed wasn't just a raise, it felt like validation. I even opened a college fund for the kids I still hope to have someday, and transferring that first $500 felt like reclaiming a future he tried to steal. Ethan's mom didn't give up her attempts either. She sent me a long, rambling email demanding that I undo what she called my false accusations and repair the damage to his reputation. I didn't respond. I simply forwarded her email to my lawyer. The silence that followed resonated louder than any threat she could have made. The wedding dress continued to haunt my closet until one morning I decided to donate it to a charity supporting survivors of financial abuse. The volunteer who accepted it commented that it might make someone feel beautiful, and in that moment I recognized that I already felt beautiful, just not in the way that dress had once represented. My brother helped me buy a condo. The $40 I'd saved went toward a down payment on a place that filled every room with sunlight. We painted the guest room a soft yellow, half joking that it might someday be turned into a nursery. He didn't laugh when I began to cry over a ruined drop cloth. He simply remarked that it was just paint, though we both knew it meant much more. I caught a glimpse of Ethan one day at the grocery store. He was in the frozen aisle, staring at a pizza as if it held all the answers. His shirt was wrinkled, and a patchy beard made him look disheartened. When our eyes met, he quickly turned down an aisle, nearly toppling a display of canned soup. I stood there clutching my basket, half expecting a surge of anger or pain, but all I felt was relief. The court notice arrived the following week, with Ethan trying to claim a portion of the wedding funds. My lawyer, clearly unimpressed by his tactics, explained that judges have no patience for liars playing the victim, and she turned out to be right. During the final hearing, the judge dismissed his case in less than 10 minutes and ordered him to repay the $15. When the gavel struck, I'd expected a triumphant rush, but instead, I just felt exhausted. Volunteering at the local library turned out to be a saving grace. They had started hosting financial literacy workshops, and I ended up teaching one on budgeting. During the session, a woman in the back wondered aloud how anyone could ever trust another person after being lied to about money. The room fell silent, and I explained that in such situations, you stop trusting others and begin to trust yourself instead. A month ago, Ethan's sister texted me an apology. Her message was brief, admitting that she had known about Jenna, apologizing for not warning me, and confessing that she was scared. I stared at the text for an hour before sending back a short response of my own that conveyed I felt the same. She never replied again, but I hope that small exchange helped ease the burden she'd been carrying. I eventually sold the engagement ring to fund a solo trip to Costa Rica. While hiking there, I met a guy who was curious as to why I was traveling alone. I made a lighthearted comment about budgeting for future kids, and he laughed, remarking that it was a smart move given how expensive children can be. We ended up talking for a long time about foolish exes and even more foolish decisions, and when we parted ways, he mentioned that whoever ended up with me next was in for a real treat. I chose not to correct him. Not long ago, Ethan's LinkedIn profile popped up in my People You May Know feed. Now working as a freelance consultant, his profile was riddled with harsh reviews, calling him unprofessional, flaky, and someone who makes promises he can't keep. I closed the tab and made myself a cup of tea. The old me might have pitied him, but now I just let the kettle whistle. Last night, I sat on a beach in Costa Rica watching the sunset. The $40 I'd fought so hard to save wasn't just a number anymore. It was a condo, a college fund, a fresh start. I used to think love was all about grand gestures, a flawless event, a perfect dress, a forever plan. But now I know it's found in the quieter moments. A brother wielding a paint roller, a stranger's genuine honesty, and the simple fact that I'm still here. Ethan couldn't ruin that. No one can. Now for the final update. It's been 6 months since I last posted about calling off my wedding to Ethan, and a few people have been asking how things turned out. Honestly, I didn't think I'd have this much to say, but life's been really eventful. Most of the wedding vendors refunded our deposits, which was a relief, but Ethan still owed me $15 for that Cancun trip he booked behind my back. His lawyer kept dragging things out by sending letters filled with vague phrases about negotiations and mutual resolution. My lawyer made it clear it was nothing more than a stalling tactic. Every time another email landed in my inbox, my shoulders tensed up. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the principle. He had lied, schemed, and even now, he couldn't own up to it. Then I ran into his cousin Mara at a coffee shop. She looked as if she'd rather have her latte than talk to me, yet she sat down anyway. It turned out that Jenna had dumped Ethan a month after everything fell apart. When Jenna discovered he had deceived her too, about leaving me quickly, about the money, even about a second wedding dress, she cut him off completely. Mara just shrugged and remarked that karma seemed to expose the truth better than any of us, a comment that almost made me spit out my coffee. I laughed at the time, but later in my car I ended up crying. Not for him, but for the fact that it took two women comparing receipts to finally expose his true colors. His family's facade started crumbling not long after. His dad's business partners pulled their investments, citing his unreliability. I found out through a Google alert I had set up after receiving threats from his mom. Part of me wondered if his obsession with a flashy wedding had been just his way of trying to live up to his father's impossible standards. But then I remembered the $5 watch meant for Jenna, and any pity I might have felt simply disappeared. Work became my safe zone. I buried myself in projects, and when I got promoted, it felt as if the universe was quietly telling me that I wasn't the problem after all. I even opened a college fund for the kids I still hope to have someday. That first deposit of $500 felt like reclaiming a future he had tried to steal. Ethan's mom didn't stop with her attacks, either. She emailed me a long plea, demanding that I retract my lies and restore his reputation. I forwarded it to my lawyer and spent that night staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone could raise a son who did all that and still blame me. The silence after that email was louder than any threat. The wedding dress hung in my closet like a ghost. One morning, I packed it into a garment bag and drove to a charity for survivors of financial abuse. The volunteer who accepted it remarked that the dress would make someone feel beautiful again. I nodded, but the truth was I already felt beautiful, just not in the way the dress had once symbolized. My brother helped me buy a condo. The $40 I had fought for became a down payment on a place with windows that filled every room with light. We painted the guest room yellow and joked about turning it into a nursery someday. When I accidentally spilled paint on the drop cloth, he simply remarked that it was only paint, though we both knew it was more than that. I saw Ethan once at the grocery store. He was in the frozen aisle, staring at a pizza as though it held the meaning of life. His shirt was wrinkled and his beard patchy. When our eyes met, he quickly ducked into another aisle, even knocking over a display of soup in the process. I stood there, clutching my basket, waiting for anger or hurt to surge through me. Instead, I just took a deep breath. A week later, a court notice arrived. He was suing for what he claimed was his share of the wedding fund. My lawyer rolled her eyes and noted that judges despise liars who play the victim, and she was right. The hearing lasted only 10 minutes. The judge dismissed his case and ordered him to repay the $15K. When the gavel struck, I expected to feel triumphant, but instead I felt exhausted, the kind of tired that follows a long fight you never asked for. Volunteering at the library ended up saving me in a strange way. They hosted financial literacy workshops, and I got the chance to teach a session on budgeting. During the session, a woman at the back asked how anyone could trust someone again after being lied to about money. The room fell quiet as I explained that you stop trusting others and start trusting yourself. Ethan's sister texted me last month with just 3 simple lines. She admitted that she had known about Jenna, apologized for not telling me, and confessed that she was scared. I stared at my phone for an hour before replying that I felt the same way. She didn't answer, but I hope it lifted some of the burden she'd been carrying. I sold the engagement ring to fund a solo trip to Costa Rica. While on a hike, I met a guy who asked why I was traveling alone. I joked that I was saving for future kids, and he laughed, remarking that it was a smart move since children are expensive. We ended up talking for hours about terrible exes and foolish choices. And when we eventually parted ways, he commented that whoever comes next would be lucky. I didn't correct him. Ethan's LinkedIn profile popped up recently. He is now a freelance consultant with reviews describing him as unreliable and all talk. I closed the tab, made myself some tea, and thought that the old me might have pitied him. Now I just let the kettle whistle. Last night, I sat on a Costa Rican beach watching the sunset. That $40 wasn't just a number anymore. It represented a home, a college fund, and a future he could never touch. I used to believe that love was all about grand gestures, perfect weddings, and fairy tale endings. Now I know it's found in quieter moments, in a brother with a paint roller, in a stranger's honest words, and in the peace of knowing I'm still here. No one could ruin that, and no one ever will.